I stood there, clutching my carry-on like it was a lifeline, the cold airport air biting through my thin cardigan. People swirled around me, businessmen rushing to gates, couples laughing, children tugging on their parents' sleeves, but I was completely alone. Not just physically, but in a way that sank deep into my bones. Abandoned, forgotten, discarded. My son had driven me to the airport. He even helped me unload my suitcase. Said he'd park the car and come help me check in. I waited, then waited some more. I called, straight to voicemail. I texted, no reply. That sinking feeling in my chest wasn't just panic, it was recognition. A realization that had been slowly building for years. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was a burden. Let me rewind. I'm not a dramatic woman. I'm 68, I raised 2 boys alone after their father died in a car accident when they were 5 and 8. I worked 2 jobs. I missed birthdays because I was doing overtime to keep food on the table. I didn't complain, not once. I told myself that the sacrifices were worth it because one day, when they were grown, I'd be able to sit back and watch them live happy, full lives. I never wanted much, just a little appreciation, a thank you here and there, a phone call on my birthday that didn't feel forced. But life doesn't always reward sacrifice the way you think it will. My younger son moved to another state after college and, to his credit, he calls me every Sunday. Nothing deep, just updates about work, his girlfriend, what he cooked that week. But it means something. My older son, Brian, the one who left me at the airport, he stayed nearby. Married young, had kids, and somewhere along the way, I stopped being his mother and became his obligation. It started small, a sigh when I asked him to help me fix the sink. A delay in returning my calls. Then came the comments. You're not helpless, Mom, or why don't you ask a neighbor? And then the subtle financial shifts. My name disappeared from shared accounts. My access to the emergency card we set up, just in case, was quietly revoked. When I brought it up, he acted like I was imagining things. You just forgot the password, Mom. He didn't hit me, he didn't yell, but he chipped away at me, piece by piece, until I began to doubt myself. Gaslighting isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just neglect wearing a polite smile. So when Brian offered to take me to the airport for my sister's memorial service in Oregon, I was genuinely surprised. It had been years since I'd traveled, and I was nervous. He knew that. He even helped me pick out clothes. Told me which suitcase to use. I let myself believe it meant something, that maybe, finally, he saw me again. That maybe he was trying. I let my guard down. I should have known better. As I stood there by the curb that morning, I noticed he didn't hug me goodbye. Just waved from the driver's seat and said, I'll meet you inside. Then he was gone. I wheeled my bag inside and waited by the check-in counter. 10 minutes. 15. I started to call him, but the screen just blinked voicemail. I sent a message. Everything okay? No reply. I moved to a bench. 30 minutes. Still nothing. I tried to check in, but the reservation was never confirmed. My ticket hadn't been paid for. My suitcase suddenly felt twice as heavy. I sat there for hours. I didn't cry, not there, not in front of strangers, but I felt something inside me crack. When it got dark and the security guards started to hover, I took a cab home. Alone, confused, and with a cold, hard knot in my stomach that something was very, very wrong. The next morning, I checked my online bank accounts. Or tried to. My access was denied. I called the bank, assuming it was some technical glitch. After an hour on hold and being bounced between departments, someone finally told me my name had been removed from the joint account I shared with Brian. The account we set up after his father passed. The one where most of my savings were. They couldn't give me more details for privacy reasons. I remember just sitting there in my bathrobe, staring at the wall. Not angry yet, just stunned, numb. It wasn't just the money. It was the audacity, the quiet, calculated way he erased me. Like I was an old coat he could drop off at Goodwill. I called him. No answer. I called his wife. Straight to voicemail. I texted, please call me. Something's wrong with the bank. No reply. 2 hours later, I tried again. This time, his wife responded, Brian's busy. We'll talk soon. Soon never came. That night, I opened a bottle of wine, something I rarely did, and sat at my kitchen table in the dark. I wasn't just hurt. I was humiliated. I had spent nearly 7 decades doing everything right. Sacrificing, working, loving, and now I was sitting in a cold house with nothing but a suitcase still packed for a trip I never took. But here's the thing about mothers like me, we break, yes. But we rebuild. And when we do, we come back sharper, smarter, less forgiving. I called a lawyer the next morning. A woman named Vanessa, who specialized in elder financial abuse. That's what she called it. Abuse. It felt dramatic at first. But as I walked her through everything, Brian controlling the accounts, isolating me from financial decisions, leaving me stranded without a word, her tone shifted from professional to furious. "He's treating you like a pawn," she said. "We're going to fix that." Turns out, Brian didn't expect me to fight back. He assumed I'd just fade into the background, too confused or too passive to challenge him. He forgot that the same woman who raised him alone was the same woman who could also outthink him. While he was busy patting himself on the back for being so clever, Vanessa and I were gathering documents, pulling statements, tracking transfers. One by one, the puzzle pieces started to fit together, and what I saw made my stomach churn. He'd been quietly moving my savings into a trust in his name. He'd signed forms without telling me, claiming I was mentally unfit to manage my finances. He'd even tried to have me marked as a dependent on his taxes, despite me not living with him. It was worse than neglect. It was a coup. The law moved slowly, but deliberately. Vanessa filed motions, sent letters, froze transfers, and finally, the hammer dropped, a full freeze on the joint account. The same account Brian had funneled my money into for months. I remember the call clearly. "The freeze is official," Vanessa said. "He won't be able to access a dime until this is resolved." I didn't feel joy. Not exactly. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity. About reminding myself that I wasn't invisible. That I wasn't just some senile old woman who could be parked at the curb and forgotten. I was a mother, a woman, a human being with a voice and a spine, and now, a lawyer. The next day, I got a message from Brian. Short, cold, "Call me." No apology, no explanation, just 2 words. I didn't respond. I wanted him to feel what I felt, silence. This was only the beginning. The road ahead would be long and ugly and full of uncomfortable truths. But I wasn't afraid anymore. He left me at the airport like trash. I left him at the bank with nothing. And I was just getting started. After the freeze went through, I expected silence. Or maybe chaos. What I didn't expect was charm. Brian called me 4 times the next day. Left voicemails that dripped with faux concern. "Hey, Mom, I think there's a misunderstanding. Let's talk." Misunderstanding? As if this whole thing was a clerical error, like forgetting to put the cap on the milk. He was pretending this was some glitch we could laugh about over brunch. I didn't laugh. I saved the voicemails, forwarded them to Vanessa, and kept my phone on silent. It's funny how quickly people shift when money's involved. Just a few days earlier, I was the ignored, inconvenient mother who asked too many questions. Now I was suddenly mom again. Now I mattered, not because I was loved, but because I was a gatekeeper to something he thought he already owned. Then came the family circle. His wife called me, first with syrupy sweetness. Maybe we could sit down and talk, just the 3 of us. As if this were a family tiff over Thanksgiving plans. I told her politely that all communication should go through my attorney. Her tone shifted instantly. "This is really disappointing, you know. Brian's trying to take care of you. You're making this harder than it needs to be." I nearly laughed. Take care of me? By leaving me stranded like a lost suitcase? By siphoning my life savings behind my back? I didn't reply. I forwarded her message too. The case was growing stronger by the day. Vanessa said something that stuck with me during our next meeting. She said, "Most women your age don't fight back. They're too ashamed. You're not just protecting your money, you're making it harder for people like him to do this to someone else." That was the first time I felt it. Power. Real power. Not loud, not violent. Quiet, steady, grounded. The kind of power that comes from surviving, observing, and refusing to be erased. Of course, Brian didn't give up. He showed up at my house the following week. I watched from behind the curtain as he rang the bell. Knocked. Waited. He didn't look like a son visiting his mother. He looked like a man who'd just discovered his ATM card had stopped working. I didn't open the door. Not because I was afraid, but because he no longer deserved the privilege of my attention. He knocked again, left a note in my mailbox. I didn't read it. Vanessa advised me not to. Let him stew. In the meantime, I took stock of my life, not just financially, but emotionally. For years, I had molded myself around my children's needs. Sacrificed vacations, hobbies, relationships. I told myself it was what good mothers did. But there's a difference between loving someone and letting them hollow you out. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped existing outside of my role as mom. And now, forced into this strange isolation, I started to rediscover the parts of me I had put in cold storage. I signed up for a painting class at the community center. It sounds silly, I know. But I hadn't picked up a brush since high school. The first week, my hand trembled like I was holding a scalpel, not a paintbrush. But by the third class, I felt something loosen in me. A joy that had nothing to do with being needed. Nothing to do with being useful. Just me and a blank canvas. I painted a stormy ocean. The instructor said it looked angry. I smiled. It is. I also began writing everything down. Journaling. At first, it was just dates and events, what Brian had done, what I remembered. But eventually, it turned into a stream of thoughts. Regrets. Hopes. Memories that hurt. I wrote about the Christmas Brian was 10 and used his allowance to buy me a necklace. I wore that thing until the chain snapped. I wrote about the time he broke his arm and cried for me in the ER. And I wrote about the first time I felt him pull away as an adult, when he skipped our Sunday dinners 2 weeks in a row and never explained why. That's when I realized, the abandonment didn't start at the airport. It started years ago. I just didn't want to see it. One afternoon, while reorganizing a box of old tax documents in my closet, I found something unexpected, a copy of my husband's will. I hadn't read it in years, maybe decades. It was written in old typewriter font with fading ink. But one line jumped out at me like it was glowing. In the event of my death, all shared assets and accounts are to remain in my wife's name for her sole discretion. Sole discretion. It was a legal phrase, but it felt like a benediction. My husband had trusted me. He'd wanted me protected. Brian's actions weren't just cruel, they were a violation of that trust. A betrayal not just of me, but of the man who raised him until age 8. Vanessa lit up when I showed her the document. "This changes things," she said. "It strengthens your position. We can prove malicious intent." The tone of the case shifted from defensive to offensive. It was no longer about just freezing the account. Now we were seeking restitution. Legal fees, damages, a formal investigation into the forged signatures on the transfer forms. The bank began cooperating more fully once the threat of a public complaint loomed. No bank wants to be known for letting a client's son steal from a grieving widow. Meanwhile, word started to spread. Families talk, even when they pretend they don't. My younger son, Daniel, called me in shock. "Is it true?" he asked. "Did Brian really do all that?" I told him everything. For the first time, I didn't sugarcoat a single sentence. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I'm so sorry, Mom. I had no idea. I thought he was taking care of you." And that's the most dangerous kind of neglect, the one that hides behind good intentions. Brian wore the mask of a responsible son, but he weaponized that mask to isolate me, control me, and rob me in slow motion. Daniel came to visit the next week. Brought flowers, sat with me on the porch. He didn't try to fix anything, just listened. Let me be angry, let me feel everything, and that meant more than any apology ever could. The legal proceedings dragged on. Brian fought back, of course. Claimed I was confused, that I had agreed to everything, that I was manipulated by an aggressive attorney. But the documents told a different story. And when the court saw the evidence, the ruling was swift. Full return of funds, punitive damages, and an official note in the record about elder exploitation. Brian's accounts were frozen for 90 days. He couldn't pay his mortgage, couldn't access his business funds. The man who left his mother stranded now found himself financially paralyzed. I wish I could say I felt triumphant. But the truth is, I just felt done, exhausted, relieved, vindicated, yes. But mostly, I felt like I had finally walked out of a room I'd been locked in for years. People asked me afterward if I forgave him. That word always feels too clean, too tidy. Forgiveness implies closure. What I felt was release. I didn't hate him. I didn't wish him harm. I just no longer felt responsible for protecting his feelings at the expense of my own reality. He sent one final message after the court ruling. A long, rambling email about how he never meant to hurt me, how he did what he thought was best, how he was under pressure. I didn't reply. I deleted it. I'd wasted too many years interpreting his silences. I wasn't going to waste another second decoding his guilt. Instead, I booked a trip. Not to Oregon, but to Maine. I'd always wanted to see the lighthouses. I packed a new suitcase. One that I chose myself. I stood at the airport a few weeks later, not waiting, not hoping, just breathing. I got on the plane. Alone. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was flying towards something instead of away from it. I left my son at the bank with nothing, not out of vengeance, but because he left me at the airport like I was nothing. Now, I carry that lesson with me. Not as bitterness, but as armor. Quiet, soft-spoken armor, forged in silence, shaped by sorrow, and polished by self-worth. And this time, I didn't look back. In the weeks that followed the court ruling, my house became quieter, but my mind didn't. There were no more phone calls from Brian, no more knocks at the door, no more vague texts pretending nothing had happened. Silence settled over everything like a weighted blanket. And for the first time in years, that silence wasn't lonely, it was sacred. I had spent so long bracing for the next demand, the next disappointment, the next sigh of irritation from a son who saw me as a speed bump in his busy life. Now, all I heard was birds outside my window, the low hum of the fridge, the slow creak of floorboards beneath my feet, my own breath. I realized how much of myself I had buried in service of being a good mom. That phrase haunted me now. Good moms give without asking. Good moms don't complain. Good moms sacrifice. Good moms forgive. I had worn that identity like armor for decades, and when I finally peeled it off, what I found underneath wasn't weak or bitter. It was raw, real, and finally ready to exist for something more than obligation. I started walking every morning. Nothing dramatic, just around the neighborhood. I'd wave to the same dog walkers and nod at the joggers who passed me. One morning, a woman around my age stopped and introduced herself. Her name was Claudia. She had kind eyes and a cane that clicked softly as she walked. We started walking together. At first, we talked about the weather. Then gardening. Then grandchildren, hers, not mine. And one day, I told her what happened. Not the full story, just pieces. Her face didn't twist with pity. She just nodded slowly and said, "Mine tried something similar. But with my house." That was the moment I realized I wasn't alone. There were others like me. Women who had given and given until there was nothing left, only to be told they were selfish for asking for anything in return. Claudia invited me to a book club at the library. I hadn't been to a library in years. The smell hit me as soon as I walked in: paper, ink, dust, and quiet possibility. The other women were warm, curious, and surprisingly blunt. They talked about the characters like they were real people. One woman, Ruth, said, "If that had been my daughter, I'd have changed the locks and left the country." We all laughed. And for the first time in so long, I laughed without feeling guilty. Without wondering if it was too loud or too much or too inappropriate for a woman my age. As my world slowly expanded, Brian's shrank. Word of the court ruling spread, first through our family, then through our community. Church friends stopped replying to his wife's Facebook posts. His business partner pulled out of a deal after learning about the financial abuse. He tried to control the narrative, of course. Claimed I was confused, vindictive, getting bad advice. But facts have a way of cutting through fiction. And the truth? It had receipts. At one point, I heard from a mutual friend that Brian was trying to host a reconciliation dinner. Not for me, for show, to stage a little performance of forgiveness and unity in front of extended family. He never invited me directly, just floated the idea through others. I didn't bite. I wasn't interested in being a prop in his redemption arc. Let him seek forgiveness somewhere else. I had no more roles to play in his life. Instead, I started focusing on my own home. I'd always kept it tidy, but now I wanted it to feel like it belonged to me, not just a holding space for other people's things. I repainted the kitchen, yellow, bright and stubborn like sunlight. I got rid of the heavy curtains and let the light in. I took down old photos that made me feel like a ghost in my own space. I didn't throw them away, I just moved them to a box in the attic. My walls were now covered with my own paintings, clumsy as they were. They were mine, not gifts, not heirlooms, just pieces of myself, finally visible. And then, something unexpected happened. I started getting letters, emails, messages from women who had heard about my case through local community groups, mutual acquaintances, even Vanessa's legal network. Women who had similar stories, being erased by their children, exploited financially, emotionally manipulated into silence. They thanked me, told me I gave them courage. Some of them asked for advice. Others just wanted to be heard. I responded to every single one. There was one letter that broke me in the best way. A woman in her 70s wrote, "I thought I was crazy. My daughter says I'm ungrateful every time I ask where my pension is going. Your story helped me realize I'm not insane, I'm just being lied to." I read that sentence over and over. And cried. Not from sadness. From release. It's strange how the act of surviving something can become a lighthouse for others still lost at sea. I never wanted to be a symbol. I just wanted peace. But if my storm could light someone else's path, maybe it was worth it. Of course, there were hard days too. Grief doesn't operate on a schedule. I missed Brian. Or rather, I missed who I believed he was. The little boy who used to crawl into my lap during thunderstorms. The teenager who stayed up late to help me carry groceries from the car. I would catch glimpses of those memories and feel a wave of longing so sharp it took my breath away. But I had to remind myself, those moments were real, but they weren't the full story. Love can exist alongside harm. Memory can be warm and still dangerous. And letting go doesn't mean pretending the good parts didn't happen. It means refusing to let them excuse the bad. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel came over with his girlfriend. They brought groceries, made tea, and sat with me on the porch. We didn't talk about Brian. We didn't need to. Instead, we talked about art, about the herbs I was growing in little pots, about a silly squirrel that kept trying to raid the bird feeder. And in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, family. Not perfect, not performative. Just real. Daniel hugged me tight before leaving and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Mom." I almost cried, not because I needed validation, but because it felt honest. Earned. Like he saw me not just as a parent, but as a person who had weathered something immense and still stood. The season changed. The leaves turned gold and copper. I started knitting again, made a scarf that was entirely too long, but proudly uneven. I made soup and delivered some to Claudia when she caught a cold. We laughed about our aching knees and swapped recipes. Life didn't become magical. It became mine. One afternoon, I opened a new savings account. In my name only. I deposited a small check from the court settlement. It wasn't a fortune, but it felt like a seed. Proof that even after all the loss, I was still capable of building. Of reclaiming. Of owning something that couldn't be taken without a fight. I've thought a lot about legacy since then. Not in the way I used to, not in terms of inheritance or property or family name. But in terms of stories. Truths. Warnings. Lessons. I don't want to be remembered as a victim. I want to be remembered as a woman who saw the storm coming and stood tall anyway. Who refused to shrink just because someone she loved demanded it. My son left me at the airport. I left him at the bank. And in between, I found myself again. Not in spite of the betrayal, but through it. Because sometimes, the deepest pain is what finally breaks the chains you didn't realize you were living in. And now? Now I live on my own terms. No more waiting by the phone. No more checking for approval. No more performing gratitude for scraps of attention. Just me, my paintbrush, my porch, and a peace so quiet it hums. Spring was just beginning to unfold its gentle arms around my little town. The frost had finally given up its grip, and tiny green shoots began pushing through the soil like little rebels. There was something comforting in that. Nature didn't ask for permission, it just grew back. No matter how harsh the winter. And in some strange way, I realized that's exactly what I'd started doing. Growing back. After the legal battle, after Brian's cold silence, after the truth had finally come to light, there was no ceremony, no final confrontation. Just the quiet business of living. I thought I'd feel triumphant. I thought there'd be a moment where I'd stand in front of the mirror and think, I did it. But life isn't a movie. There was no soundtrack swelling in the background. Just me, drinking coffee, watering plants, opening the windows to let the air in again. But there was a change. A quiet one. I stopped flinching every time my phone rang. I stopped checking the mailbox expecting bad news. I started answering "How are you?" with something other than "I'm fine." And more than anything, I stopped apologizing for needing space, time, or peace. I began spending time at the senior center more regularly. Not just volunteering, but listening. Really listening. So many women, just like me, had lived their entire lives under the weight of someone else's needs. They came in smiling, polite, quiet, modest, and within 10 minutes of talking, they'd start to crack open like old photo albums. One woman told me her son changed the locks on her own home while she was in the hospital. Another whispered through tears that her daughter had moved in just for a few months, and 5 years later, she was still sleeping on the couch while the daughter ran up credit card debt in her name. We'd been raised to believe that motherhood was sacrifice. That love meant putting everyone else first, no matter the cost. But no one warned us what would happen when the people we loved learned how to exploit that sacrifice. I became a sort of unofficial counselor. They called me Miss Elaine, even though I told them not to. I didn't feel like anyone's elder. I felt like a survivor finally turning her scars into a map for someone else to follow out. One afternoon, after a long session helping a woman dispute unauthorized withdrawals from her bank account, I found myself sitting in the library parking lot, just staring at the horizon. I thought about how many years I had given to my children. The birthdays I worked through. The nights I stayed up sewing Halloween costumes, helping with homework, scrubbing floors, balancing bills. I thought about how I used to watch Brian sleep when he was a child, his tiny face pressed into his pillow, and feel this overwhelming, aching love that made my chest feel like it would burst. And then I thought about how that same child had once looked me in the eye and said, "You don't need access to the account anymore. You don't do anything with it anyway." That memory still stung, but it didn't define me anymore. It used to burn like acid. Now it just hummed in the background, a reminder of how far I'd come. A scar, not a wound. That weekend, I got a letter in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting instantly. Brian's. It was a single sheet of paper. No envelope liner. No gift card tucked inside. Just a few carefully written lines. "I've been reading your blog. I know it's about me. I don't blame you. I hope one day you'll write something different. Not for me, for you, for peace." I stared at it for a long time. Not because it touched me, but because it was the first time he didn't try to control the narrative. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer excuses. He just acknowledged it, quietly. I didn't respond. I didn't write about it either. At least, not then. I folded the paper and tucked it into a drawer with the others, the custody documents, the court ruling, the bank letters. Not as a keepsake, as evidence of what I'd endured, of what I'd overcome. Later that night, I sat at my computer and opened a blank page on the blog. And I wrote this. Sometimes we wait for people to say they're sorry, thinking it will set us free. But freedom doesn't come from their words. It comes from our decision to stop needing them. I hit publish, closed the laptop, and sat in the dark with a cup of mint tea, letting the silence wrap around me like a soft coat. Because the truth was, I didn't hate Brian. I didn't even resent him anymore. What I felt was deeper, stranger, more complicated. A kind of grieving acceptance. Like standing at the grave of someone who's still alive, knowing you'll never get the version of them you needed, but finally understanding that you'll be okay without it. The next chapter of my life didn't come with fanfare. It came in the form of routine. Predictability, comfort, but not the dull kind. The kind that feels earned. I'd wake up early, stretch by the window, feed the birds, and walk to the corner bakery for a warm croissant and light conversation with whoever happened to be in line. I stopped needing distractions to feel okay. I stopped jumping at every noise, every message. I was finally grounded. One day, while planting herbs in the backyard, I heard a child laughing in the next yard over. It was such a pure, bright sound, sharp and soft all at once. I looked up and saw a little boy playing with a toy plane, arms stretched out like wings. And for a second, just one, I thought of Brian at that age. How he'd run barefoot through the grass, calling himself Captain Brian, fearless and loud and completely mine. I smiled, not because I missed it, but because I could finally remember without breaking. I realized in that moment that I was no longer mourning my son. I was mourning the idea of who I thought he was. And once I let go of that illusion, I was free to see everything clearly. Not just the pain he caused, but the strength I had to rebuild from it. People in town started noticing me, not as Brian's mother or the woman from that court case, but as Elaine. Just Elaine. One woman even asked if I was starting a support group. "You have a way of making people feel brave," she said. That stuck with me, so I did it. I started a group. We met once a week in the library's back room. We didn't call it therapy. We called it reclaiming space. No judgment, no advice unless asked. Just women talking, listening, sharing. At first it was 4 of us. Then 8. Then 12. Stories poured out like water from a cracked dam. Stories of daughters who manipulated, sons who ghosted, spouses who vanished. Stories soaked in love and shame and exhaustion. But through it all, something electric happened. We were healing. Together. Out loud. I began to see that what I had endured wasn't just personal, it was systemic. Generational. Cultural. Women being taught to serve, to smile, to survive quietly. And I was done being quiet. Vanessa, my attorney, reached out not long after. She had heard about the group and invited me to speak at a legal education event. "You're living proof," she said. "And people need to see that it's not just about laws, it's about lives." I was hesitant at first. But then I thought, if even one woman walks out of that room with the courage to draw a line, it would be worth it. I stood in front of a room full of professionals and told my story, not for sympathy, but as evidence. Evidence that it can happen to anyone. That manipulation doesn't wear a mask, it wears a smile. That neglect doesn't always scream, it sometimes whispers. And that sometimes, the people who claim to protect you are the very ones chipping away at your existence one harmless decision at a time. Afterward, a young paralegal approached me. She looked barely 25. Her eyes were glossy. She said, "My grandma went through something similar, but we didn't know until it was too late. I wish she had someone like you." And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a cautionary tale. I felt like a lighthouse. By summer, I'd reached a place I never thought possible. I was no longer surviving the betrayal. I was thriving beyond it. I had structure. I had purpose. I had friendships built on truth, not duty. I no longer defined my days by what I had lost. I defined them by what I had reclaimed, my time, my voice, my identity. Then, out of nowhere, Daniel, my younger son, called to ask if he could visit with his new fiancée. They'd gotten engaged quietly and wanted me to meet her before announcing it. My first reaction was a knot in my stomach. Not from him, but from the fear that history might repeat itself. That I might once again be seen only as an accessory to someone else's life. But when they arrived, it was different. She greeted me with warmth, but no assumptions. She asked about my paintings, my writing, my life, and Daniel. He looked at me with something I hadn't seen since he was a boy, pride. Not pity, not worry, just pride. Over dinner, he raised his glass and said, "To my mom, who reminds me every day that strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just refuses to disappear." I didn't cry, not then. I waited until they left. Then I sat on the porch, the moon lighting up the garden, and I let the tears come. But they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of confirmation, of recognition, of deep, still joy. Because I hadn't just gotten through the betrayal. I had rewritten what came after. And now, when I think back to that day at the airport, the cold, metallic air, the confusion, the growing horror, I don't see a woman abandoned. I see a woman being set free. He left me behind like I was nothing. But I found everything in the life I built without him. It was a quiet Tuesday morning when I realized I no longer flinched at the sound of my name. There was a time when Mom or Elaine spoken by a certain voice would send a wave of tension through my whole body, like a pulled wire ready to snap. But that morning, sipping tea on the porch, feet tucked under me, sunshine filtering through the trees, I heard a neighbor call out Elaine. from across the street, and I simply smiled. No bracing, no freezing, just acknowledgement. My name had become mine again. Not a summons, not a weapon, not a manipulation, just me. There's a kind of power in getting older that no one talks about. Not the fragile cliches about wisdom or patience, but the raw truth that comes when you finally stop trying to be digestible. I no longer needed to make myself small so others could feel big. I didn't soften my voice to avoid being too much. I didn't pretend to agree just to keep the peace. My peace mattered too now. That shift seeped into everything. My home looked different, lighter, simpler. I got rid of furniture that was only there for guests I no longer entertained. I turned the dining room, once reserved for holidays with Brian and his family, into a reading nook. Shelves full of stories, a chair that hugged me, a lamp with soft yellow light. I called it my sanctuary. And it was. One afternoon, as I rearranged some books, I found an old family photo buried in a drawer. It was from a trip to the beach, me, Brian, Daniel, and their father. Everyone smiling. The wind had caught my hair, and I remember feeling so tired that day, but trying not to show it. I stared at the image for a long time. Not with longing, but with tenderness. That woman in the photo, she was doing her best. Carrying the weight of 4 lives on her shoulders. I whispered thank you to her and slipped the photo back into the drawer, not as a keepsake, but as an acknowledgement of everything she endured so I could become who I am now. Later that week, I was asked to speak again, this time at a university panel on elder advocacy. I almost declined. The idea of standing in front of college students and professors made me nervous. But then I thought about how many of those students might become the next generation of attorneys, caregivers, policymakers. Maybe, if they heard from someone like me, they'd remember that the elderly aren't just numbers in a file. We're not fragile relics of the past. We're people, with histories, with pain, with power. I wore a simple gray dress and pinned a small blue brooch at the collar. The room was modern, glass walls, rows of black chairs, digital screens. I felt out of place for a moment. And then I began to speak. I told them about the airport. The lie, the freeze, the silence, the fight. I told them about how easy it is to overlook neglect when it wears the mask of responsibility. How a child's concern can become a leash. How a mother's love can be turned against her if she's not careful. I watched their faces shift, confusion, discomfort, understanding. I ended with this. We live in a world that applauds children for taking care of aging parents. But who's watching to make sure that care isn't control? Who's asking the mothers what they need? It's time we start listening to the quiet ones before their silence becomes a scream no one can ignore. Afterward, a young woman approached me. She said, "My mom's going through something like this." I didn't believe her at first. I thought she was being dramatic. But now, I think I need to call her. That moment alone made the whole day worth it. When I got home, there was a letter in the mailbox. Handwritten, from someone in my support group. She wrote, "You showed me that the end of their story doesn't have to be the end of mine." I held that note to my chest and cried. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming feeling that maybe, just maybe, I had turned all that pain into something that mattered. I began keeping a journal again. Not the kind I used during the legal mess, no bullet points, no facts, no timelines. This one was different. I wrote about the way the sun felt on my shoulders when I walked in the morning. About the smell of coffee in the kitchen. About how I caught myself humming while folding laundry and realized I hadn't done that in years. I wasn't recording my survival anymore, I was recording my living. One entry read, "I used to think peace was something that came after forgiveness. But now I know peace begins the moment you stop waiting for anyone to give it to you." Another, "Sometimes I miss what never was. The version of my family I imagined in my head. The warm reunions, the unconditional love. I grieve for the fairy tale I kept trying to write with a pen that ran out of ink years ago." There was something so liberating about admitting those things to myself. I didn't have to pretend anymore. Not for neighbors, not for Daniel, not even for the ghost of the mother I used to be. Speaking of Daniel, our relationship deepened in ways I never expected. He visited more often, not out of obligation, but out of genuine connection. He'd call just to say hi, to ask what I was reading, to tell me about a new dish he tried cooking. His fiancée, now wife, treated me like an equal, not a relic. She'd bring me fresh herbs from her garden and swap baking tips like we were old friends. At their wedding, I wore a pale green dress and stood with the other guests, not at the family table. By choice. I didn't want a front row seat for appearance's sake. I wanted to watch with quiet joy, from a place of freedom. During the reception, Daniel made a toast. He thanked everyone, and then, unexpectedly, he turned to me and said, "To my mother, who taught me that love doesn't mean silence. It means standing tall, even when others expect you to shrink. You didn't just raise me. You raised yourself, again. And I'm proud to be your son." There was a hush in the room. Then applause. I didn't cry, I smiled. Wide and real. Weeks later, I was walking home from the bookstore with a tote full of poetry when I saw her, an older woman on the corner, struggling to carry her groceries. I offered to help. She hesitated, then handed me a bag. We walked in silence for a moment. Then she said, "I've seen you speak. You're the one with the son, right?" I nodded. She looked down at the pavement. "Mine hasn't spoken to me in 3 years. He told people I was crazy. I'm not. But it hurt." I said gently, "They always say it was for our own good." She looked at me, eyes glistening. "But they never ask what we wanted." "No," I said, "but we know now. And that's what matters." We parted ways, and I kept walking. The wind was soft, warm. I felt tall, not just in stature, but in spirit. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't living through anyone else's lens. I wasn't someone's mother, someone's cautionary tale, someone's dependent. I was just me, entirely. Finally. I still have bad days. Some mornings I wake up with the weight of memories I didn't invite. I still sometimes check the mail and half expect another apology or another excuse. But those moments pass like clouds, and I don't chase them anymore. I let them drift. Now, I spend most evenings with a book or music. Sometimes I paint. Sometimes I just sit with a cup of tea and the knowledge that I built a life no one can take from me again. And when I think back to that airport, when I was left alone, confused, humiliated, I no longer see a tragedy. I see a beginning. Because that was the moment I realized no one was coming to save me. And maybe that was the greatest gift of all. The older I get, the more I realize that healing doesn't always look like fireworks or declarations. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It looks like turning off your phone without guilt. Like laughing too loud at your own joke. Like grocery shopping without rushing home to report to anyone. Healing is space. It's time. It's the decision to live in your own rhythm, even if the world you came from can't dance to it. One Saturday, I took a day trip to the ocean. Alone. I hadn't done that since my 20s. I packed a sandwich, a book of poetry, and a folding chair. Drove myself 2 hours along the coast, parked by the dunes, and made my way down to the sand. The wind was brisk, but the sun was generous. I sat for hours, letting the waves speak in their language, the one that doesn't care who left you or what they took. Just movement, consistency, presence. I watched families walk by. Couples, children chasing foam. I didn't feel envy. I didn't feel loss. I just felt there. And for someone who'd spent so long feeling invisible in rooms full of people she loved, that was everything. At one point, a little girl passed by and waved at me. I waved back. She shouted, "You look like a nice grandma," and kept running. I laughed. Not because I wanted to be a grandma, but because I looked like one. To a stranger. And somehow, that meant I looked like someone safe. Kind. Someone who belonged in the world. I stayed until the sun began to lower. Packed up my chair. Took off my shoes and walked along the edge of the water. And as the cool tide curled around my ankles, I felt something unexplainable settle in my chest. Not joy, not peace, something stronger, wholeness, the feeling of nothing missing. Driving home, I passed through towns that reminded me of different chapters of my life. Some full of memories, others just blurs. And somewhere between mile marker 47 and the blinking gas station sign, it hit me. I had survived not just the betrayal, but the erasure. I had lived through someone deciding I wasn't worth seeing, and found a way to make myself visible again. To myself. That's the real victory. Not the frozen accounts. Not the court order. Not even the applause from strangers. The real win was coming back home to the woman I'd been before life asked her to disappear for everyone else's comfort. When I pulled into my driveway, the porch light had come on by timer. The plants on the steps were blooming. My wind chime clinked softly in the evening air. It looked like a postcard. Like a place someone would send love letters to. And it was mine, all of it, built not from money or inheritance, but from truth. From surviving. From choosing to stay soft in a world that had tried to harden me. Later that night, I lit a candle and sat by the window with a notebook. I wrote a letter, not one I'd send, but one I needed to write. To the woman I used to be, I forgive you. For the silence, for the trying, for the stretching and shrinking. You did what you had to do to survive. But I'm not her anymore. I'm not surviving now. I'm living. You can rest. I've got it from here. I folded the letter and tucked it between the pages of the poetry book I had brought to the beach. A little secret between me and the sea. Now, when people ask what happened between me and my son, I don't tell them the whole story. I just say, he taught me how strong I really am. And I taught myself how to never forget it. Because sometimes, the people who abandon you are the ones who unknowingly free you. And sometimes, being left is how you finally return to yourself. So no, I'm not angry anymore. I'm not waiting for apologies. I'm not hoping for a reunion. I'm building a life that doesn't require anyone's permission or participation to be whole. And every time I see a plane overhead, I smile. Because I know now, I wasn't left behind. I was launched.